Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Irish Institute for Catholic Studies lecture this week. And our speaker is Dr. Richard Butler. Richard is Director of Research at Mary Immaculate College in Limerick, and he's an urban and social historian of modern Ireland and, to a lesser extent, of modern India. Richard studied engineering as well as the history of art at St. John's College in Cambridge. His MPhil explored British colonial architecture in India. He was Gates Scholar at Cambridge, and his doctoral thesis explored the architectural, social, and political history of the Irish courthouse and prison in the 18th and 19th centuries. He held a Fulbright scholarship at the Department of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the States, and he also worked as a journalist in Kathmandu and as a book editor in Ireland. Richard was appointed Associate Professor of Urban History at the University of Leicester. In 2017, he was a Moore Institute Visiting Fellow at the National University of Ireland in Galway. In 2019, he was a visiting fellow at the Centre for Urban Studies, MSU, in India. In 2021, he was a visiting fellow at the School of History in the University College Cork. Richard has published his research on the history of the Irish Catholic Church in journals such as the Journal of British Studies, Rural History, and Irish Historical Studies. He has also co-authored an article on religious fundraising and church building in Cork City in the 1950s and 60s, and that is forthcoming in the journal Era Ireland later this year. So, Richard, we're delighted to have you with us today. He's going to speak about donors and donations to the mid-20th century Irish Catholic Church.
That's great. Thanks very much, Trish, for that wonderful welcome. Actually, I'd like to just begin the lecture by expressing my deep thanks to Trish and to the Irish Institute for Catholic Studies for this kind invitation to speak today. As Trish mentioned, I'm now working at Mary Immaculate College. I joined around a year ago, and I've tried where possible to tune in to this particular lecture series. In my role in the college, I support the research work of all academic staff in the college, but some of you will know my own specialism is modern Irish history, broadly across the 19th and 20th centuries. And as Trish mentioned, I have in recent years published some research on the history of Catholicism and the institution of the Catholic Church in Ireland in the 20th century. My training is very much in archival research, and what I've been writing and publishing is based almost entirely on time spent studying historical documents in various diocesan and local government archives, for example, in Galway, Cork and Waterford. I deeply appreciate the access that I have been given to these repositories and to the assistance of archivists, diocesan secretaries and of course bishops and priests, both serving and retired, who have a keen interest in historical research. Could someone say that the slides are working? Hopefully you can see a bunch of boxes from
They're working. We can see them.
Okay, very good. I'll keep going then. My work took me to Galway for about 3 or 4 months in total in 2016-17, during which time I was very grateful to be based at the Moore Institute at NUIG. And also my work took me to Waterford in 2020, just before the pandemic, and to Cork for about 6 or 7 months, actually during 2020. And a lot of this research and work happened during the pandemic, and I think that that required staff to make special arrangements for me to visit and to work in a safe and socially distant manner. And I think I owe them all a very special word of thanks for making that possible. It definitely wasn't easy to do. As many here will know, gaining access to archives has been extremely difficult over the past few years, with many archives just completely closed because of the public health restrictions. So in this lecture, I'd like to offer some reflections on what I have termed donors and donations to the mid-20th century Irish Catholic Church based on this archival research. This is, I think, a subfield within Irish studies where major advances have been made in recent years, thanks to a new generation of historians, I think, interested in from below approaches to understanding how and why people in Ireland donated so generously to the Catholic Church. For example, the UK research body, the Economic and Social Research Council, the ESRC, funded a 3-year project called Visible Divinity, Money in Irish Catholicism 1850 to 1921, and that was funded in recent years. The key people in this project were Dr. Sarah Roddy, now at Maynooth University, but formerly at Manchester University, and Dr. Patrick Doyle, now at the University of Limerick, but also back then at the at Manchester University. Writing in the Journal of Social History, Drs. Doyle and Roddy note that, quote, between the end of the Great Famine and the end of the union with Britain, the Irish Catholic Church was almost exclusively funded by ordinary lay people, adding that their research indicated that, quote, previous conceptions of lay people coerced into giving their money to the church are too simplistic, and they deny the complex agency of the people of many social classes who gave this money. When in time the full findings of their research project have been written up in books and articles and published, I think they are very likely to fundamentally reshape our understanding of how and why ordinary people donated money and other material gifts to the church across the 19th and 20th centuries. Drs. Doyle and Roddy's work too is, I think, complemented by many others, all part of what I mentioned as a new generation of historians interested in religion in modern Ireland, including, for example, Professor Cara DeLay, Dr. Niamh McGowan, Dr. Caroline McGee, Dr. Lisa Godson, and many others. For my own small contribution to this field, back in 2015-16, I got a little bit of money from the British Academy to begin research on the building of Galway Cathedral in the 1950s and 60s. And a few years later, I applied for a larger amount of money from the UK government body, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the AHRC, to undertake research into the role of religion more broadly in the planning of Irish cities in the 20th century. This project began, as I mentioned, only a few weeks before the pandemic struck and was ended early as such when I moved to Mary Immaculate College. But it did allow me and my colleague, Dr. Tom Spalding, to do a lot of archival research in the meantime. And very much inspired by Drs. Doyle and Roddy's work, Tom and I decided to focus on the question of donors and donations for building new Catholic churches in the mid-20th century. As anyone, I think, who has walked around any Irish city or town will know, a huge number of new churches were built roughly between the 1930s and the 1970s, mostly very large buildings to serve the overwhelmingly Catholic population of new suburbs. While there has been some research in recent years into their architectural design, for example, by Dr. Lisa Godson, Dr. Ellen Rowley, for example, there has not been so much research into what you might see as the broader cultural, never mind economic history of these buildings. Indeed, while the 19th century history of donations to the Irish Church is now increasingly understood, there is little, I think, if any, work done on donors or donations or fundraising or economics of the Church in the years after Irish independence. To try and open up this conversation, so to speak, Tom and I have co-written an article which Trish mentioned there at the beginning, which will be appearing in Era Ireland this summer on the extensive fundraising campaigns in the Cork and Ross diocese under Bishop Cornelius Lucy's guidance in the 1950s and 60s for the building of 10 new churches, including the large building that you see here on the screen in Dennehy's Cross in Cork. In this article, we analysed thousands of donations, both large and small, as well as the giving of non-monetary gifts such as wedding rings and family heirlooms to be melted down and incorporated into the tabernacles of these new churches. I'll say more about the Cork Church's appeal later in this lecture. But one of our conclusions in this article, I think, closely echoes that of Drs. Doyle and Roddy in their work, that a purely financial or statistical history of donations does not adequately convey the multitude of reasons why people donated money or gifts. While Cork's Catholics clearly did respond to calls for donations from their bishop and priests, they also went beyond what was asked of them, making donations often anonymously because of their faith, their devotion, and their attachment to their church. Fundamentally, and as many here will know, the Irish Catholic Church depended and depends today on donations from its community, in regular weekly collections, in dues, in bequests, and so on. Unlike other churches in Europe, it does not receive direct state funding through taxes or tithes. I have found that it's often, I think, a huge surprise to many people in Ireland to hear that there are, in fact, legally enforced taxes in some other jurisdictions for the funding of the funding of churches. Despite this, the title of my lecture today, Donors and Donations to the Church Across the 20th Century, is, I think, one that would today elicit quite a strongly opinionated response in general conversation. The finances of the church in these years, for example, are now inescapably linked to the horrors suffered by many young women in religious institutions, by those with mental health problems who were locked away in hospitals or homes, by children in the adoption system, or those abused by that subgroup of priests who were violent or predatory. Into this aspect of modern history, there are, of course, questions of redress, compensation, culpability that I think every academic historian of the church wholesomely supports. Those, I think, that have looked in a detailed way into the history of kind of the administration of the institute in this era, I think also point out that the web of responsibility is complex and messy in these years, that the state, for example, fundamentally failed its citizens and turned a blind eye to its own constitution, and that what we now rightly see as crimes committed against vulnerable people were at the time permitted, if not endorsed, by large swathes of the Catholic upper middle class. But as this lecture is about donors and donations, I don't wish to lose focus by commenting so much more on this particular subject right now, only to say that these revelations, I think, are always there on my radar as I research and as I write about the church in these years, and I know that they are for all of my academic colleagues. I think they inform our understanding of the institutional church in these years. There is, though, I think, another public response to questions of Catholic donations and finances in these years, say of the mid-20th century in particular. And this is very different and a lot less serious than what I've just been speaking about. This is one which is essentially conditioned by the 1990s TV sitcom Father Ted. This is the money was only resting in my account narrative, the money-hungry parish priest who coerced the faithful into giving money and who lived, or at least fantasized about, an extravagant, decadent lifestyle. These are all images that people, I think, almost everyone in Ireland knows so well. The implication here, of course, is that only a naive parishioner would give money to the Irish Catholic Church. I think those interested in Irish culture in the 1990s may well point to the resignation of Bishop Eamon Casey in '92, subsequent revelations of diocesan funds incorrectly used to support his child in the United States, something that must surely have filtered its way into the making of Father Ted. Yet, as Drs. Doyle and Roddy have argued, we should be sceptical of what I think at times can be a patronizing image of the naive parishioner. Apart from those very well publicized cases, as I mentioned, of the misappropriation of church funds, or of the lives of a small number of celebrity bishops and priests, the archives of the church show that a more representative day-to-day running of the institution was an altogether more mundane affair. Lists of donations were published regularly in the diocesan magazines and the newspapers. Regular reporting from parish priests to their bishop listed donations and expenses down to the shillings and the pence. Priests were almost universally afraid of any kind of financial irregularity or even suspicion of such, often writing nervously, for example, to their bishop on such matters. Donations were indeed sought and bequests facilitated, but priests were also sometimes surprised by large gifts and indeed a few times expressed weariness at all the work and organisation that would be required to see through a donation for a specific purpose. This is not to suggest, of course, that priests were anyway more conservative than those with whom they interacted in their daily lives. Their risk aversion in these years was much the same as one finds, for example, in the archives of any state department, any local government office, for example, and the same with business owners, accountants, the legal profession, the medical profession, and so on. I suppose what I'm suggesting here is that actually these figures from the past were a lot more normal and relatable in some ways than sometimes they can be portrayed, particularly in satire, of course. I don't mean to suggest that, of course, that there's no humanity or colour or flares of drama in church archives. The Catholic Church in Ireland was and is a large non-profit organisation with, especially in these years, enormous commitments across many strands of society, including education, medical care, housing, community centres and halls, and of course churches. The challenge with writing on the subject of donors and donations to the church is to get beyond a kind of dry economic or financial history of the institution. The archive would, I think, very easily allow such a history to be put together, showing the state of donations, investments, bequests, outgoings, and so on. One could produce a very detailed Excel spreadsheet, and one could stop there. But the job of running a diocese, especially, for example, a large one, as I'll speak about today, the Cork and Ross diocese, was not always an exciting one, as, for example, the minutes of the Cork Diocesan Trustees meetings would indicate. But the real challenges for the historian are, I think, twofold. One is to read the archive against the grain, to try and understand how and why lay people donated to the institution. And really that's work that Drs. Doyle and Roddy have been leading on in recent years, among others. And also, I think, number two, to write not so much a financial history of the institution, but to write a cultural history of it that does not parcel off the day-to-day administration of a large organisation from the lay people who saw themselves as part of it, or indeed from questions of faith and belief, questions of why this all happened. I'd like to present as such some stories from the archive to demonstrate the above points and maybe to open up a discussion. I'll focus on the Cork and Ross Diocesan Archive, considering the time available today, but I want to add to that I see it as representative of the others that I have spent time working with. It forms a useful case study because of its large geographical size, of its balance between urban and rural, Cork City, and then that balance by almost all of West and South Cork, by having Ireland's second largest city within it. Furthermore, I think it had great continuity in leadership across much of the 20th century. Daniel Colan served as bishop from 1916 to 1952, and Cornelius Lucy, or Connie Lucy as often known locally, from 1952 to 1980, and Bishop Lucy here on the right, of course. For those doing the maths, I'm talking here about terms of 36 and 28 years, so very, very long times to be in charge of this diocese. So the first kind of story I want to just talk about is from the archive, is the Tabernacle Fund. I mentioned earlier Bishop Lucy's plans for new churches in the diocese from the 1950s onwards, and the Cork Churches Appeal Fund, which was the entity through which these donations were channeled. As Tom Spalding and I discuss in our forthcoming Era Ireland article, this was by any stretch an astonishingly successful appeal that was taken up with fervour by Cork's Catholics, both young and old, women and men. In pure monetary terms, the majority of the funds raised came from weekly parish collections, from Cork businesses and from the city's wealthy elite, plus substantial donations from the Irish American community in cities such as Boston and New York. But I think what is more interesting is the extent to which we find small, often anonymous donations sent in by the lay people of Cork. This is most apparent, I think, in the Tabernacle Fund, as it was called, which sought to commission tabernacles for each of the new churches. While there is a strong argument that there was some expectation that the laity would give and be seen to give in the weekly parish collections, these anonymous donations to the Tabernacle Fund were purely optional. They were, I think it is fair to say, made by people of faith because of their faith, and I think this makes them all the more interesting for a historian to look at today. The Tabernacle Fund was run by Frances Wren from her home in the southwest of Cork City. Donations were printed in the diocesan magazine, The Fold, from November 1953 until well into the 1970s. The Tabernacle Fund was overwhelmingly the preserve of Cork's women, and while it included some monetary gifts, it comprised mostly gifts of wedding rings, jewellery, and precious stones and metals. Frances Wren arranged for the valuable metals to be melted down and reused, and to have the jewels inserted into the tabernacles of the new churches. Over the space of 14 years, there were almost 2,000 donations made as printed in the fold. And here, some of them lined up for a photograph from the April 1960 issue of the fold. These, I think, provide a rich source for analysing, in particular, female agency and more broadly devotional culture in mid-century Ireland. Frances Wren, born Frances Cunningham, was an influential member of Cork's Catholic elite. Her stewardship of the Tabernacle Fund brought conservative religiosity and social respectability to the practicalities of collecting jewellery and precious metals for the tabernacles of these new churches. A domestic economy teacher fluent in the Irish language and married to the Cork County manager, Frances Wren served alongside Bishop Lucy as a member of the Irish government's Commission on Emigration in the 1940s and 1950s. She toured agricultural shows in Munster as a judge for cooking and baking competitions, and The Complete Book of Vegetables and Fruit, published through the 1940s, found a home in many an Irish kitchen, and indeed I've come across it in some kitchens. Wren wrote the Women at Home section of the Fold magazine from its founding issue. In it, she mixed together traditional Catholic family values with recipes for soups, breads, cakes, and other topics that she considered of interest to housewives. Her only son, Francis, was ordained a priest. He died in 2006, and he spent his career ministering in the Cork and Ross diocese, and he served as the intermediary for many of the donations given to his mother as part of the Tabernacle Fund. As highly decorated vessels for the reservation of the consecrated Eucharist, tabernacles were quite literally the jewels in the crown of Cork's new churches, admired by the Catholic faithful and the focal point of the building located behind the main altar. Souvenir pamphlets of new churches often feature close-up photographs of these tabernacles with their lock and key, their gilding, and their inlay of precious metals and diamonds. On the opening of St. Francis's Church in Cork in 1953, the Cork Examiner noted that the crowning feature, they said, of the whole scene is the gorgeous tabernacle. Its interior is of solid gold and jewels, composed of the free gifts of thousands of the faithful. The Cork Evening Echo suggested that, quote, "It is probable that every family in the city has played its part, and that is as it should be," they said. The art of designing and building tabernacles was highly specialised and time-consuming. Each cost at the time on average £450, or about the same as buying a new car. Wren began her appeal by asking for, quote, "gifts of gold, jewellery, precious stones and money for a new church in Gorona Broher in Cork City, the first of Lucy's new city churches. These gifts, she promised, would, quote, "recall in the years to come your pledge of love and loyalty to Jesus and to your parish," promising to, quote, "acknowledge all gifts personally and that no lists will be published." She quickly changed tack on the latter as parishioners began posting her gifts and more gifts and a kind of a flood of gifts. And her appeal was quite quickly broadened out to include all of the new churches planned in the diocese. From 1953 until her death, this monthly Women at Home section included lists of largely anonymous donations, sometimes taking up an entire page of the fold. In general, they were very small amounts of money, if indeed money was given. The smallest donor, who termed themselves For Marian Year, gave just 2 shillings and 6 pence. And in 83% of cases where the gender can be identified, the donations came from women. Donations often included a dedication, the most common being in memory of, for example, a deceased family member. Cash donations were, however, only a small part of the fundraising effort, yet they still raised almost £3,000 overall. The median there was £2, the mode just £1. The majority of gifts reached Wren's office anonymously, either via intermediaries, largely priests, or simply in envelopes that were, for example, marked anonymous by post or registered post Copine. As some here will know, Copine is a village in West Cork. And here you can see on the screen one of these many lists of the Tabernacle Fund donations, giving you a sense of dedications, the use of pseudonyms, what is being given, and so on. The extraordinary success of the Tabernacle Fund reinforced Wren's confidence in the faith and the goodwill of Cork's Catholics, and especially of its women. The appeal was, she believed, a call to homemakers to build a tabernacle home for the hidden Jesus in our midst. She was moved by the personal nature of so many of the gifts, writing that, quote, long-cherished keepsakes of saintly mothers will now find a resting place in the new churches. Offerings, she noted, were pouring in from, quote, the little homes of the diocese. As the tabernacles were unveiled, she featured photographs of them in the fold, proudly announcing that, quote, the entire cost has been defrayed by readers of this page. And here, the first of those new tabernacles for the church in Gorona in Cork. None of these meant more to her than the tabernacle for what became her new parish church at Dennehy's Cross in the southwest of the city. It included, for example, no fewer than 200 jewelled engagement rings and 300 golden wedding rings, and the entire cost was paid for by the women of the local Children of Mary sodality. My gaze, she wrote, rested on the gold and jewelled tabernacle, and I recalled the very many wedding rings which had been melted down to line the interior of it, and of the many diamonds surrendered to decorate it within and without. And here you can see a picture taken in recent times where those rings are very much apparent and prominent on the main door of the tabernacle. On the eve of the opening of this church, she added that what she termed a little lady came to her with a donation of a linen covering for the altar, which was used for the consecration day. Her contributions to the fold include several such descriptions of how women chose to give gifts anonymously and without attracting notoriety. For example, in 1961, she said, there came to me on a June Sunday a small paper bag marked on the outside Anon. I tore off the cellophane tape which fastened it and out spilled shining golden coins, 31 sovereigns, 26 half sovereigns, to be used for the tabernacle in the new church of Our Lady Crowned at Mayfield, also in Cork. The character of these gifts and the pseudonyms and dedications attached to them speak to the everyday devotion of Cork's Catholic women in these years. The decision to give such personal and intimate items of jewellery for melting down or incorporation into the new tabernacles was clearly not made lightly. These donations include in total, for example, at least 1,100 gold rings, 21 diamond rings, many of which were noted as the wedding or engagement rings of deceased parents or partners, items which Eilis de Vara refers to as the most prized possession of Cork women in this era. Jewellery made up the bulk of the gifts, 628 watches, half of which were gold, 200 chains, 133 brooches, 67 bracelets, 45 pairs of earrings, 24 pairs of cufflinks, and 3 pearl necklaces. Other donations included 400 sovereign or half-sovereign coins, 274 gold or silver medals, many of which, for example, had been awarded in sporting or musical competitions, for example, through the GAA or the Feis Ceoil. More unusual were medals for military service, including one donation of an American military medal. Donors also gave a wide range of other personal and household items that had valuable metals in them that could be melted down and reused. They include the absolute ordinary of life at this time: teapots, sugar bowls, cigarette cases, crucifixes, bells, candlesticks, chalices, precious stones, inkwells, spectacle cases, vases and jugs, pencils, table stands, decanters, knives. Donors even used the Tabernacle Fund as an opportunity to gift items to other Catholic families, including a complete outfit for a deserving boy making his first Holy Communion, along with frocks, shoes, and even prayer books. As noted above, the majority of these donations were given anonymously, though donors typically included a pseudonym or a dedication. And here we've tried to make an image of those. Beyond cases of in memory of or the inclusion of someone's initials, many pseudonyms gave indicators of gender and of class. A grateful widow, a lock woman, an area in Cork City, a poor donor, factory employees, nurse, working girls, a widow's mite. Some focused on personal devotion, for example, from an admirer of the servant of God, Matt Talbot, while others simply gave context: contents of purse found, half of money received from England. Many spoke to personal struggles, for example, unworthy, a sinner, for an abandoned soul, believer in prayer, pray for the donor, and one in poor health. 2 donations in 1962 marked, I think, quite poignantly tragedy and loss, simply saying, in memory of little Catherine. The Tabernacle Fund developed momentum that sustained it long beyond other parts of Lucy's fundraising drive. By the mid-60s, all of Cork's new churches had been provided with tabernacles. At this time, Wren considered winding up the appeal, but donations kept pouring in, and when a new tabernacle was proposed for the rural parish of Ballinadee near Bandon in 65, dozens of gifts were made, mostly from the women of the locality. This was quickly followed by an appeal for a new tabernacle for Lucy's missionary church in El Porvenir district of Trujillo in Peru, and then for 2 more Peruvian churches. So that would give you some sense of the richness of the archive in terms of female donations. But what about, I suppose, church building more generally? Well, if one went for a walk today around some of the suburbs in Cork City where these new churches were built in the 50s and 60s, and perhaps fell into conversation with local residents, I think it's fairly likely that one would be told that it was the bishop and his priests who decided that new churches were needed in the city and that the people would have to pay for them. But the archive suggests, I think, something else. Bishop Lucy and his priests, particularly his canons, did think about where new churches might be needed, which churches were in such poor condition that needed replacement and so on. But there was also pressure from below to build new churches, pressure which the bishop sometimes had to resist. And of course, if a new church was to be built, how else could it have been funded except through donations from the laity? The Catholic Church in Ireland was, as I said earlier, not funded through state taxes. And where parishes had built up savings, they were often earmarked for specific projects, either legally through bequests or informally through long-standing and well-publicised plans in parishes. It might be, for example, that a primary school needed an extension, and this was seen as more important than a new or a refurbished parish church. One clear example of from below pressure to commit to building a new church can be seen in Crookhaven in these years. As many will know, Crookhaven is a little village at the end of the Mizzen Peninsula here in West Cork. With such a small population, it was perhaps understandably seen as less of an urgent priority than, say, the vast new corporation housing estates in Grona-Roher or Ballyfihan in Cork City. And yet, in November 1950, a group of 10 men who called themselves the Crookhaven Church Building Committee asked to meet with Bishop Daniel Colan in Cork to make the case for the building of a church in their village. In a follow-up letter, they wrote, "We thank you for the kind reception you gave our deputation when approached with regard to the building of a little church in Crookhaven. We now enclosed signed list of the people who require Mass here on Sundays. The most of these people are poor and have no means of travelling 10 miles to and from Mass in Goleen. These people will be very grateful if you could arrange to have Mass celebrated in Crookhaven Schoolhouse for the present time, and maybe Deo Volante, God willing, our little church will follow in the near future." The committee attached here 5 pages of signatures to their letter, which included more than 120 signatures in all of local residents. Some of them gave their age, for example, 78, 90, 89, to further emphasize the need locally. One signatory gave a New York address, which may have been a way of indicating that Irish American donations could have been forthcoming. But in this case, despite community pressure to commit to building a new church, the bishop declined to give the project the green light. Instead, there were extensive renovations undertaken to the parish church in Goleen in the late 50s, but no respite for the inhabitants further west who still faced the journey from their village. Far from a bishop forcing a new church on local community, what we have here is an example of the dynamic working in reverse. The priority, it must be assumed, was the new city suburbs, whose cause Bishop Lucy took up from the early 1950s onwards. And sometimes in the world of donations and donors, there were shocks and surprises. Father Danjo Donovan, later a canon in the Diocese of Cork and Ross, was instrumental in the building of a new church at Dennehy's Cross in the city in the late 1950s, during which time he was a curate in the Loch parish in the south inner city. It was the first of 4 new churches that he oversaw in the space of 20 years, and that I think may well be a record in the history of the Cork and Ross diocese. Appointed parish priest in Cora in 1959 in West Cork, he built a new church there and was then brought back to the city a few months after the loss of St. Michael's Church in Blackrock to fire to oversee its replacement. In the early 70s, he built another new church in Tor in the city. Of all the priests in Cork, say in this time period, there certainly was no one else who was involved in building as many churches as Father Dan Joe Donovan was. He was very much a community organizer and a people person. He was the kind of priest who could oversee the building of a new church and so was relied upon by the bishop on multiple occasions. Earlier in his career, for example, he served as president of the Cork Catholic Young Men's Society. The archive is richest on the second of these 4 churches that he oversaw. And this is the rural parish church of Cora. Here's the old church in Cora, which was taken down when the new one was built. Father Donovan arrived in Cora in September 1959 with the new church at Dennehy's Cross in Cork almost complete. But any hopes of simply sitting back and relaxing in his new rural parish in his early 19th century church, as shown here, were quickly extinguished. Instead, within a few weeks of arriving, he discovered that following a death in the parish, a large bequest of roughly £5,000 was on its way, specifically for the building of a new church, and that this meant that there were now sufficient funds to go ahead with a long-standing plan of replacing the building you're looking at. He had no choice as such but to build another new church. He wrote to Bishop Lucy in October 59, saying, "I enclose copy of the will. It shook me. It looks as if Reverend Michael Carmody, his predecessor, decided on it being used for this church. The only thing is to carry on, and the Lord will direct us, as you say." Father Michael Carmody had been the parish priest in Cora for many years and had left 6 years earlier to become the parish priest in Douglas in the city. He had helped arrange this particular bequest during his time in Cora, the results of which now fell to his successor. The money came from a Miss Reardon, a spinster who lived locally with her sister. She was a reclusive person who lived a frugal life. It's clear from correspondence that she was quite a vulnerable person, though I don't mean to suggest by that that she was in any way taken advantage of. Rather, the money involved here had come to her through inheritance from a brother who was killed tragically in a wood logging accident in Portland, Oregon. As Miss Reardon's bank manager explained to Father Carmody, she appears quite happy over everything, and she wishes to leave this money now here on deposit, where it will be under her own control in case if anything were to happen to her suddenly. She has again emphasized leaving all her money to charities and for masses. She is pleased that the big money has been invested for the proposed new church, please God, in due course. I mentioned how Bishop Lucy's name will now be included in this trust. Father Carmody explained to Bishop Lucy how the bequest had been arranged. I think it's worth quoting here in detail as to what he said. So he wrote, "They asked me what they would like to do with all that money. I suggested that they sell the farm and go and live in Bantry or Dunmanway, nearby towns, where they have relatives on the interest of the money. They wouldn't see their way to do that, as the farm kept them occupied. I read for them the part of the enclosed letter from Dr. Daniel Colin, the bishop, which says, if a good legacy came my way, I would be disposed to earmark it for a new church someday in Cora. Each said then, sure, we can do the same. I strongly advised them to go see their solicitor, draw up a will for each. They did so and appointed me executor and trustee. I disliked the responsibility, but in the circumstances they regarded me as the only one they could trust and would have nobody else. They both suffered from paranoia, imagined all their neighbours were against them, and were most suspicious of everyone. They gave me verbal instructions regarding the priests whom they wished to get offerings for masses. Fast forward to Father Dan Joe Donovan then in 1959 and the execution of this particular will. Father Donovan wrote to Bishop Lucy explaining that Miss Reardon's main request was that 2 of Cora's priests, as mentioned above, could be memorialised in some way in the new church, and he sought permission from the bishop, as he wrote, for a slab with the names of all the dead parish priests to be erected in the new church. He then proceeded to oversee the building of this church which was consecrated soon after he moved to the city to begin yet another building project. As I kind of drawing to a conclusion now, there were also, as anyone I think involved in non-profit organizations will know only too well, donations given for very specific purposes that could not be used for anything else without tiresome legal paperwork. Through the 19th and 20th centuries, the Cork and Ross Diocese built up an extensive collection of such bequests, funds, donations for specific purposes, and so on. In 1940, Bishop Daniel Cohen established the Cork Diocesan Trustees to bring together these individual funds under an umbrella organisation. The practice before being that funds were held in trust by perhaps 2 or 3 priests and the bishop, with constant vigilance required in case of the deaths of any of the trustees. Some of these funds were tiny, others were very large. There was money earmarked, for example, for a new cathedral in Cork and for a new church in the South Parish. There were smaller funds generating annual dividends for the St. Anne's Hostel and for the St. Patrick's Orphanage in the city. A bequest from William Martin Murphy, infamous for his role in the Dublin lockout of 1913, was returning £10 a year for poor relief in Bantry. The diocese tended to invest bequests and donations in safe havens, in bank stocks, national debt, railway companies, and so on. It managed funds whose annual surpluses were used to support the St. Vincent de Paul in the city and to cover some of the running costs of the Bessborough Mother and Baby Home. From the early 50s onwards, the Cork Diocesan Trustees became the main clearinghouse for the vast sums of money raised for building the new churches in the city, as I mentioned earlier. One of these funds that fluctuated a lot over these years was called the Aged and Infirm Priests Fund. As its name suggests, this was essentially an insurance fund for the priests of the diocese. Clergy in Ireland were largely excluded from National Social Insurance, or PRSI as we now call it, until 1988. They had very limited access to disability benefits or pensions if forced to retire early, being classed as self-employed persons in the state's eyes. While the old age pension was in place throughout these years, it didn't help the diocese in cases of ill health, accidents, or disability. Again, in lieu of state funding for the church, it fell to each diocese to establish their own funds to help their own priests. In Cork in both the mid-50s and again in the early 60s, this fund was drawn down very heavily to support priests in the diocese who ended up in trouble. Priests in this era were certainly not poor, of course, and were better off than many of their parishioners, but I'm highlighting this particular fund to show how the institution of the church had to take care of its priests as they did their work, in a way that I think is a little surprising to see from the perspective of our world today. And finally, as I mentioned throughout this lecture, the institutional church in these years was not a charity with an unlimited budget. It had many quite predictable, mundane, day-to-day outgoings, which were carefully reported and monitored in a culture that was avowedly conservative in a financial sense, if not a cultural sense. Priests were required, for example, to separate out the donations received each year in normal collections from those for Easter and Christmas, and those given to shrines in churches. They had to set out to the shilling and the pence the amount they spent buying candles each year, for example, paying organists, heating and cleaning schools, and repairing parochial houses. It was not all one-way traffic, though, and from the early 50s, Bishop Lucy took up the cause of providing better houses for his priests, something he set out in a brief memo at the beginning of his time as bishop, underlining key points in this particular memo. There appears, he said, to be doubt and diversity of practice in the manner of what is and what is not the personal responsibility of the priest for the house he occupies in virtue of his office or appointment. I am making no change in the traditional arrangements in this sphere. A, these arrangements are: the occupant of a house is personally responsible for rent, rates, and other outgoings. He is similarly responsible for the internal maintenance and decoration of the whole house. B, the maintenance of the fabric, fixtures, and external of the house are parish responsibility. From these two things follow, namely, that without the permission of the bishop, it's not permissible or just to take or give parish money for outgoings, decoration, etc. The permission of the bishop is not to be presumed. It must be sought, giving reasons, and will be given only where the circumstances are exceptional. Secondly, it is the duty of the occupant to maintain the house in a decent and clean state. This means not merely painting, etc. inside and keeping 1 or 2 rooms. It means keeping all the rooms, though not necessarily furnishing all the rooms. He ended by saying priests deserve good houses. It is inexcusable in these days to have priests in houses with no water laid on, letting in water, and the like. I quote this memo to make, I suppose, the specific point about the quality of priests' houses in these years and Bishop Lucy's desire not to have his priests living in unacceptably poor conditions, but also to make a more general point on the tone in which financial matters were discussed in these years, and of the way in which priests were held to account by their bishop. Again and again, the culture was one of prudent conservatism, and similar to what one would find, I think, in any large organization, or, for example, in the civil service in these years, or I think even now. And so I'll end there just to make sure there's time for any questions or comments. As I began by saying, the subject of donors and donations to the mid-20th century Irish Catholic Church is, I think, one of considerable public interest and also controversy. In trying to shine some more light on this subject, I'm attempting to explain how the institution operated in practice, to give a sense of the scale of the Church's commitments in different areas, and also to try and better understand how and why ordinary parishioners were such keen supporters of their church in these years, in many cases going beyond what was asked of them. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Richard.